Most gate outbreaks begin with chaos, sirens, screaming civilians, hunters rushing into the unknown before the monsters can spill into nearby cities. This one began with silence. Hundreds of kilometers off the coast of Western Australia, the offshore mining platform Southern Crown stood alone against the Indian Ocean. The platform had been built to extract a newly discovered mana-rich mineral from beneath the seabed. Since gates had become part of everyday life, mana crystals had become more valuable than oil. Entire industries had sprung up around them, and Australia had invested billions into deep-sea mining operations like this one. The Southern Crown employed over 100 workers, protected by a small hunter security team. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that would ever make the evening news. Until the night the ocean stopped moving. The security team consisted of one B-rank hunter, Captain Ethan Cross, a veteran whose grey hair and scarred face hinted at decades spent clearing gates across Australia. With him were 4 C-rank hunters, a swordsman, a lancer, a marksman, and a water mage, along with several D-rank support hunters responsible for barriers and emergency evacuations. For a mining platform, it was more than enough, or so everyone believed. At 11:47 p.m., the drilling crew reported unusual resistance, nearly 2 kilometers beneath the ocean floor. The drill wasn't cutting through rock anymore. It sounded hollow. The vibration echoed through the entire platform. The chief engineer frowned as strange symbols flickered across the mana sensors. "Captain," he muttered into his radio, "I think you'd better come down here." Captain Cross arrived minutes later, boots ringing against the steel walkways. He studied the monitor, showing a massive concentration of mana beneath the drill. Too much mana. No crystal deposit should produce readings like that. "Shut it down," he ordered. The engineer hesitated. "We've already informed headquarters. They want one more sample." Cross didn't answer immediately. His instincts, sharpened over 30 years, screamed that something was wrong. Then every light on the platform flickered. The vibration stopped. Complete silence settled over the rig. Even the engines had gone quiet. "What happened?" someone whispered. No one answered. Outside, the ocean had become perfectly still. Not calm, still. The waves had frozen into gentle swells that no longer moved. The wind disappeared. Rain that had threatened all evening simply ceased. It was as though time itself had forgotten the sea. One of the workers laughed nervously. "That's impossible." Captain Cross slowly walked onto the outer deck. The Indian Ocean stretched endlessly into darkness. Then, the fog arrived. It rolled across the water unnaturally fast, swallowing the horizon within seconds. Thick grey mist climbed over the frozen ocean until visibility shrank to less than 50 meters. The platform's radar erupted with contacts. 1, 5, 20, 40. Dozens of large objects surrounded the rig. The radar operator's voice shook. "Captain, they're moving toward us." "What are they?" "I don't know." Cross lifted a pair of binoculars. At first he saw nothing. Then shapes emerged from the mist. Tall masts, torn black sails, ancient wooden hulls gliding silently across water that no longer moved. Ships, not one, an entire fleet. The oldest worker on the platform crossed himself. "No." One of the younger miners laughed. "Is this some historical reenactment?" Nobody joined him. The ships weren't using engines. Their sails hung limp without wind, yet they continued drifting forward, closer, closer, until the nearest vessel emerged completely from the fog. Its hull was blackened with age, covered in seaweed and barnacles thick enough to hide the wood beneath. Hundreds of lanterns burned along its rails, green flames. Not one crew member moved on deck. Captain Cross lowered his binoculars. Battle stations. Every hunter immediately understood. This wasn't normal. Mana alarms began screaming throughout the platform. A gate, not nearby, directly beneath them. Before anyone could react, the sea exploded. Not upward, downward. The ocean beneath the drilling platform collapsed inward, as though something enormous had opened below it. A column of black light erupted into the sky. The gate had opened. Every hunter instinctively released their mana. Blue barriers shimmered around the central control room while workers scrambled toward evacuation shelters. Captain Cross barked orders. "Protect the civilians! Nobody engages until I give the word!" The Ghost Fleet stopped. Every ship floated motionless around the platform, waiting. The silence was unbearable. Then, boom, a cannon fired. The ancient cannonball arced toward the platform. Workers ducked instinctively. Instead of exploding, the black stone shattered against the steel deck. Dark mist poured from the fragments. Every light it touched died instantly. Metal rusted before their eyes. Steel railings crumbled into orange dust. One of the D-rank barrier hunters stared in disbelief. "That wasn't gunpowder." "No," Cross said quietly. "It was cursed mana." Then every ship fired. The night exploded. Hundreds of black cannonballs screamed through the air. The hunters unleashed barriers just as the first barrage struck. Steel twisted, walkways collapsed. Communication towers snapped like matchsticks. The mining rig shuddered violently. A second volley landed. This time, something climbed out of the smoke. A skeletal hand gripped the railing. Another followed. Then another. Water poured from ancient armor as skeletal soldiers pulled themselves onto the platform. Some wore rusted breastplates. Others still carried chipped cutlasses and boarding axes. Empty eye sockets glowed with pale green light. No flesh. No voices. Only the sound of dripping seawater. The nearest skeleton tilted its skull toward a terrified miner. It raised its sword. Before it could strike, one of the C-rank hunters flashed forward. His enchanted blade cleaved the skeleton cleanly in half. The bones scattered across the deck. The young hunter grinned. "That's it?" The skeleton's bones rattled. Every fragment began pulling itself back together. The grin vanished. Within seconds, the skeleton stood once more, completely unharmed. The first scream echoed across the platform. Then hundreds of skeletal pirates began climbing over the railings at once. Captain Cross drew his massive mana-forged greatsword. Its blade erupted with blue light. "For Australia!" he roared. The hunters charged. Steel met bone. Magic illuminated the darkness. For a brief moment, humanity held the line. But beyond the platform, more ships emerged from the endless fog. Not dozens, hundreds. Their green lanterns stretched across the frozen ocean like a second night sky. And on the largest ship of them all, a lone figure stood at the helm. Unlike the skeletons surrounding him, he still wore flesh. Pale as drowned marble, his long black coat hung heavy with seawater that never stopped dripping onto the deck. In one hand, he carried an ancient brass lantern, whose ghostly flame burned a deep, unnatural blue. Slowly, almost patiently, he looked toward the southern crown. Then he smiled, not with anger, not with hatred, but with the quiet certainty of a man returning to reclaim something that had always belonged to him. Captain Cross felt a chill run through his entire body. He had fought ogres, wyverns, demons, and dragons. He had survived gates that had wiped entire hunter guilds from existence. Yet as he stared across the frozen sea at the silent captain aboard the ghost flagship, he realized something he hadn't felt in decades. Fear. Not fear of dying. Fear that whatever had come through this gate was never meant to be called a monster. The skeletons came in endless waves. Every one Captain Cross cut down simply collapsed into a pile of bones before rolling across the steel deck as though pulled by invisible strings. Within moments they stood again, seawater dripping from empty eye sockets that glowed like dying embers. It wasn't an army. It was the same army refusing to stay dead. The hunters fought with everything they had. The C-rank swordsman severed skull after skull. The lancer hurled enchanted spears through entire lines of undead. The marksman fired mana-impregnated rounds that shattered skeletons into clouds of splintered bone. The water mage unleashed torrents that swept dozens of pirates over the railings. It didn't matter. Minutes later, every skeleton climbed back aboard from the black ocean below. Captain Cross understood first. "Don't throw them overboard," he shouted. "The sea is bringing them back." But by then it was too late. The deck had become a slaughterhouse. Emergency lights flashed through thick smoke as workers fled deeper into the platform. The D-rank barrier hunters struggled to hold evacuation routes open, while the mining crew crowded inside reinforced shelters. A deafening crack echoed overhead. One of the drilling cranes collapsed, crushing several undead beneath hundreds of tons of steel. The skeletons simply clawed their way back out. The water itself refused to let them die. Cross slammed his greatsword through another pirate before grabbing his radio. "Headquarters, this is Southern Crown. We have an S-rank gate outbreak. Repeat, this is an S-rank outbreak." Only static answered. The cursed cannon fire had destroyed every long-range transmitter. They were alone. Another explosion rocked the platform. The ghost flagship had finally reached the rig. It towered over the steel platform like a floating cathedral of rotten timber. An ancient boarding bridge slammed onto the deck. Silence fell. Even the skeletons stopped fighting. Every undead pirate stepped aside as though making way for royalty. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed across the wood. The captain walked onto the mining platform. His boots left puddles of seawater that shimmered black instead of reflecting the emergency lights. He appeared almost human. Almost. His pale skin looked stretched over something far older than flesh. Barnacles clung to the sleeves of his coat. Seaweed drifted behind him despite the complete absence of wind. Most unsettling of all, his brass lantern cast no shadows. Captain Cross raised his blade. "Who are you?" The stranger studied the hunters with tired eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like waves crashing inside a cave. "You dig too deep." Cross stepped forward. "This is Australian territory." The captain tilted his head. There were no nations when this prison was built. The hunters exchanged confused glances. "What prison?" asked the water mage. The captain slowly pointed toward the massive drill tower, still extending into the darkness beneath the ocean. "You mistook chains." His gaze settled on the drill. "For treasure." Before anyone could react, the platform shook violently. Far below, something answered. Not a roar, not a scream, a heartbeat. One enormous pulse echoed through the ocean. The entire sea moved. For the first time since the gate had opened, waves returned. Not naturally. The water rose in slow, impossible swells surrounding the platform. Captain Cross looked over the railing. Something colossal shifted beneath the surface. He couldn't see its shape, only an eye, larger than the mining platform itself. It opened beneath the black water, then disappeared again. Every hunter froze. The pirate captain lowered his head. "It wakes," Cross finally understood. The skeletons weren't invading Australia. They were guarding something. The drilling operation hadn't uncovered mana crystals. It had broken ancient seals. He turned toward the control room. "How long until the drill overloads?" The chief engineer's frightened voice came over a damaged speaker. "If we force the mana core into critical overload," he hesitated, "the whole platform will explode." Cross nodded. "Do it." The surviving hunters stared at him. "We'll die," whispered one. Cross smiled sadly. "If that thing reaches the mainland." He looked toward the endless Australian coastline, hidden beyond the horizon. "Millions will." The alarms changed. Instead of evacuation warnings, a calm, automated voice repeated the same message over and over. "Mana reactor overload initiated. 5 minutes to detonation." The pirate captain closed his eyes. "You choose well." Cross frowned. "You're not stopping us?" "I cannot." The ancient captain lifted the brass lantern. "My duty was never to protect the prison." His expression became unbearably sorrowful. It was to warn those who reached it. The skeletons slowly lowered their weapons. Every undead pirate turned toward the sea. They weren't attacking anymore. They were waiting. The second heartbeat shook the platform. This time steel beams bent. Concrete cracked. Something beneath the ocean was pushing upward. The hunters made their stand around the reactor room anyway. Wave after wave of skeletons charged them, not out of hatred, but desperation. The swordsman fell first, the lancer moments later. The marksman emptied his final magazine before disappearing beneath a tide of bones. The water mage used every remaining drop of mana to freeze an entire boarding bridge, collapsing dozens of pirates into the sea. Then her mana gave out. Captain Cross stood alone. His armor was shattered. Blood ran freely down one arm. His great sword had lost its glow. The countdown reached its final seconds. The pirate captain looked directly at him. "For what it is worth." He placed a hand over his heart. "Your people fought with honor." Cross laughed despite everything. "Tell that to history." The reactor exploded. A pillar of blue mana erupted through the center of the platform. The blast consumed steel, ships, skeletons, and sea alike. For one brilliant instant, the black eye beneath the ocean closed. Then everything disappeared beneath fire. 3 days later, Australian search and rescue vessels reached the coordinates where the Southern Crown had once stood. There was nothing. No oil slick, no bodies, no floating wreckage. It was as though the entire mining platform had never existed. Officials declared it another tragic gate disaster. The public accepted the explanation. Eventually, people stopped talking about it. A week later, a fisherman walking along an isolated beach north of Perth noticed something resting in the sand. An old brass lantern. Its metal was untouched by rust. Inside, a blue flame burned quietly, though no fuel remained. The fisherman reached toward it. Before his fingers touched the handle, he heard distant creaking, wood rubbing against wood, like an old ship changing course. He looked out across the Indian Ocean. The sea was empty, completely still. Then, far beyond the horizon, tiny green lights appeared in the morning mist. 1, then 3, then dozens. The fisherman blinked. The lights were gone. He laughed nervously and picked up the lantern. It felt warm, almost alive. Later that evening, the Weather Bureau issued an unusual report. For nearly 20 kilometers around the coordinates where the Southern Crown had vanished, the ocean had stopped producing waves, as if something deep beneath the sea had gone back to sleep. For now.